On the one hand, we have people really waking up to the health aspects. I've heard it likened to having a good exercise regime. A good light hygiene has huge benefits. On the other hand, we have property values going through the roof and a need to build dense. Ultimately, there's sort of basic ways you're going to interact with a building, right? Is it too hot or cold? Is the air fresh? And after that, or maybe at the same level, is daylight and sunlight is sort of the handshake of the building in many ways.
Welcome to Sunlight Matters, the podcast that reconnects us with the sun. Join us as we explore the power and influence of our star, the force at the heart of everything. Each episode, we speak with leading experts to uncover the ways sunlight shapes our world.
Welcome to today's episode of Sunlight Matters, and joining me on a lovely sunny day is Paul Rogers from Stockholm. So, Paul, I don't know whether it's sunny in Stockholm, but it's certainly sunny here in the UK.
Well, thanks, Dave. I can say that in Stockholm today, it is not that sunny. Actually, we're glad to see the rain. It's been a rather dry period. I just got back from the summer house in Spain yesterday, and I still have a tan. So it's really nice to sort of show off that tan at work. I'm kind of flaunting it a little bit, I must say.
Totally. Well, I've just had a nice holiday as well. It's kind of interesting getting away before the summer actually starts. So I sort of feel I'm prepared for the sunshine to come.
Well, I do find that the body can be very thirsty for sunshine, and I get sort of topped up often in Spain, and I feel a lot more relaxed afterwards. And the rain doesn't bother me so much afterwards.
Well, and it's interesting because you introduced us to Arnie Loden, and we recorded a brilliant podcast with him about winter in the northern sort of territories, and he was talking about actually one of the things that you should think about if you do get things like seasonal depression due to sort of lack of sunlight is actually to just go abroad. And it sounds like we've both taken his advice before we got it, and it's great. It's great.
Yeah, I mean, it adds so much to get that extra dose, and you come back and maybe it's not so much the weather isn't something that concerns you, that it's raining or foggy, or maybe you appreciate that a little more because you're not your body's not screaming for getting its dosage.
Yeah, indeed. So you work for ACC Glass and Facade Consultants. Would you be able just to tell us a bit about who they are and what they do?
Yeah. We're about 35 people, offices both in Stockholm and Gothenburg. We're a facade consultancy company. So we have all sorts of specialized services from construction, inspection. We have a calculation department for daylight and thermal comfort. So I'm part of the Daylight Thermal Comfort Group, and we have some very interesting group of people from sort of all over the world that have come here to work in Sweden. Some very, very bright people. I guess there's a bit of a brain drain from places like Greece and Spain and Bulgaria. So we have people from fantastic people to work with, and very, very interested, passionately interested in everything that has to do with the sun. It's great. We can sit down and really, when I first started this specialty in all things daylight, sunlight, I was sort of all alone. It was the end of the 90s. Not there weren't so many people that were interested, but it's become rather topical in the last decade. And it's sort of a dream come true to sort of sit around with other daylight sunlight nerds and to be able to talk about equation of time or any of these kind of very obscure solar related things.
So I'm interested. So what I mean, you talk about being there in the 90s. What's your background, and how did you sort of suddenly say, well, actually, sunlight really matters?
Yeah, well, I'm educated as an architect in the 90s, and it came out in 95. And I did a thesis. I guess over the course of my master's, I got quite frustrated by people saying, okay, this design works a certain way. It's energy efficient or it has good daylight. And I was very much into, well, you need to show that. You need to prove it. And at that time, I did notice in myself that daylight and sunlight was very important to me. And so I sort of went out on a mission, and I became very scientifically focused in the preparation of my master's thesis. It was almost like starting a new degree. There was a lot of engineering, which I had to sort of learn on my own. So it took me sort of 4 years to do the thesis. Now I was also working professionally at the same time. So it was a nice mix, but it very much became to me interested in how buildings, the energies of the world, the natural energy of our planet interacts with the built form that we have.
Right.
So we came out of school, just to the dawn of the 2000s, and there weren't so many people interested. So I got by for the first 5 years making pretty pictures and renderings, which is a kind of simulation. But I didn't realize, like, after 6 years how much I hated it, because it's blue skies and balloons and happy babies, and it's the opposite of what I wanted to do, right? It was sort of a sales job on something which was a bit false. So my employer at the time was good enough we had a good talk, and they were good. They had enough vision. It was Bow Architect here in Stockholm, and they had enough vision to see that, well, this was something that we should let this guy do. And from then on, I was very lucky that there was a time when third-party building certification was starting to really take stride. And I started generally working with certification, but I got very interested in daylight, and I was sort of became one of the few people at the time that was experienced in that and knew how to do simulations. And from there, I just started to hire really talented people. Really, to me, they're the best of the best. Some of them have been with me 8-10 years now. So it's been quite an inspirational journey, actually, to be able to do what I really want to do. It's been a dream come true. And that's basically to think about the sun and the sky.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible when you actually talk about it, that going back a few years or a few decades, that we'd kind of almost lost that connection with the sun, and thank goodness we're sort of now back in a position where lots more people are really sort of interested in that connection. And I guess architecture is embracing it. So we'll talk a bit more about architecture. Well, but I was just wondering if you could talk about why you think sunlight is so important to humans. And
I think as a practitioner, we normally divide between daylight and sunlight. The daylight is often what the codes are based on, and a lot of the scientific literature refers to the health benefits of daylight. So what sunlight is, of course, is the direct beam from a clear sky or directly from the sun. I think that sort of the subtlety is missed there, because I think that's what most people respond to. So if I talk to my mom there in Canada, my 86-year-old mom, and I say, like, how was your day? And she'll talk about how the sunlight streams into the living room and how that improves her mood. And I do think this sort of patterning of sunlight, it's really underestimated, not just generally, but even when we start talking about daylight in terms of architecture, the patterning of the direct beam over the course of the day and the year, and how that changes. A number of years ago, I did an article for DA Magazine where we took 4 famous buildings and examined how light, or the patterning of light over the year and over the day, how it differed, and sort of some of the deeper meaning behind that. There's something really fundamental about when our buildings have that interaction and interplay with the sun. It sort of ties us to some sort of, I don't want to sound too crazy here, but it ties us to something that is timeless and is fundamental to all life on Earth. It's really inspirational. It goes beyond just sort of the joy or inspiration that we get out of it. It also goes back to sort of our roots as human beings on the Earth.
It's really interesting, because I guess, and I'd be interested in your perspective about some of the older buildings, and if you've looked at sort of the impact of sunlight on kind of famous buildings. Did architects, I guess a few hundred years ago, were they really thinking about the interaction of the
I do
sun?
think so. In particular, those buildings that didn't have electrical light, which came much later. I think there's certainly a sort of a fingertip feeling for daylight, even maybe up to the 50s or 60s. It was sort of part of what you needed to
Wow.
make a good building. Some of the best architecture and how it relates to daylight is from the 50s, and I think those people, they didn't have simulation tools. Instead, they used often paper models and worked on the detail level. Alvar Aalto is one that I always talk about, a Finnish architect, where there's so many variations of skylights and playing with the aperture and looking how light spreads in different manners. That can only be done through modeling, and probably at the time be physical modeling. But I do think that maybe that's something that's lost in the education. I think somewhere around the 60s, 70s, 80s, there began to be more of a focus on other things. Maybe it's societal aspects. I'm not sure, and I'm not saying that's for the worse. Only that daylight dropped off the agenda a little bit, and with the generation of architects that are going on pension now, that maybe that was prioritized less than it would have been previously. Some of the greatest buildings, of course, are working with daylight. I mean, the Pantheon, we go all the way back to that, and that was one of the buildings we looked at, and just how its patterning was so unique. And then just about anything from where you have often two orientations, and there's all sorts of different variations. If somebody would pay me full time to go through and just make case studies of these old buildings, that's what I would do, because there's so much to learn from
Well,
them.
I mean, we met because I think you'd found Shadowmap online, and that was, I think the interaction we had. But it's sort of one of the things that I'm interested in using a tool like Shadowmap is actually, putting models of older buildings in, and then going back in time
Yeah,
and saying, well, what
in
did the sun
in particular,
orientation look like in sort of 2000 BC or whatever?
yeah, and I think orientation is so key. Like there's a famous church by the architect Johan Utzon. He also did the Sydney Opera House. It's called the Facade Cathedral. Um, it's my Danish is not not as good as my Swedish, but anyways, it's really interesting. There, if you look, like you say, if you put it into Shadowmap and you look at it, and what you see is there's sort of an inner chamber and then there's an outer chamber. The outer chamber has skylights, and the inner chamber is open to the west. And so when you put it into Shadowmapper, you can see, okay, well, it early in the morning it's going to be lit in one way. It's going to be lit from the perimeter with this diffuse light. And then at a certain time, which Shadowmapper will tell you exactly what time it is, the sun's going to come around to the west and it's going to start going into that other aperture, and it's going to quickly change and it's going to become something totally else. Where it was sort of all about the perimeter light from the sky earlier, and then in the late afternoon it becomes all about this west facing aperture and the dynamism that it provides. So it just sort of, yeah, we tend to look a little bit more in our investigations on the interior level, but it starts with that putting it into a plan and looking at those cardinal points, east, west, north, south. Very, very important stuff. And again, this gets a little back to your Stonehenge kind of idea that this is where we come from,
Yeah, I mean, if I totally agree. I mean, and it's interesting you've kind of made that distinction between daylight and sunlight, and that as you've been talking, it's sort of the pennies dropping in my head, because like so many, I think I sort of bunch them together, but they're two very
Yeah, well,
separate
I think because it goes back to when we needed to calculate by hand. So the diffuse light from the sky, daylight, was one thing. And that's very good for compliance with building regulations, but it's insensitive to direction, to cardinal points. But then also you had more of an angular calculation, which was for direct sun. And that's why, or sunlight, and that's why those traditionally are handled differently. But now is, for example, a European daylight standard, which allows you to sort of bake those two into one, which is a much nicer calculation, because we're often sort of in this daylight factor diffuse sky, and so our clients will say, well, how can that room be so bad? It's open to the south. And then we have to explain, well, daylight factor doesn't see that. Well, I'll tell you, those people living there will see that. And so there's sort of a fatal flaw in a lot of the way our codes are built.
Right.
And of course, there's been a lot of discussion about going over the European standard methods, but the building industry is normally fairly conservative on a lot of fronts. So it's not about to jump into, say, a new more complex metric, which maybe is a little more difficult to understand, more complex to calculate. But the thing is, there's such a benefit of doing that way, because it's so much closer to what our perceptions are. But it's been a bit lukewarm for the European standard. I hope that on its next generation that hopefully it'll be picked up a little more by the legislators.
And those standards, I guess, we've got within our legislator, I mean, I guess in the UK, for example, you've got a right to light, which is sort of written into our legal framework.
Yeah, that's a bit of a like you have both the building code, but you don't have a mandatory in the UK, and that's really too bad.
Right.
But then you have the right to light, which is a separate system.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's interesting, because you'll have to forgive me because I don't understand where all of these things sit. But I mean, I was reading a very interesting legal case about a couple who are suing a developer because essentially they've lost their afternoon sunlight, and it's not daylight, it's sunlight, because someone's built a whacking great tower near them, which sort of blocks out the afternoon sun. And it was interesting because I modelled it all out on Shadowmap, and you can kind of see why they might be slightly pissed off, to be honest with you. But I just wondered if you with your knowledge, you've kind of got any thoughts on that and other things which are kind of going on, because I guess as people move into cities and there's pressure on cities, you're seeing a lot more kind of tall buildings being built, and that will impact people's lives, won't it?
Yeah, I read about that one. I get quite excited when I see that somebody stands up and sort of can put their foot, and that the legislative framework works. With densification, over the past few years, the housing's been a little bit slower in the new starts. So we've had a bit of a shift in a lot of what we do now is with regards to, as you say, people who complain whether or not somebody's taking their daylight and sunlight. And I think it's really fantastic. I wish more people would do it, because I do think it does affect people. What I like about this case is somebody just sort of stood up and said, this is, and they were able to, because they were able to get the process to work for them. Quite often I'll see a complainant make the complaint too soon or too late in the process. So even though they have a valid complaint, that they haven't understood the process well enough to get it going. And that's really too bad. There's lots of stuff gets approved that shouldn't get approved if people are informed. And I guess we can get back to a tool like Shadowmap, which I'm a big fan of, because it democratizes. People don't have to rely necessarily on a daylight specialist. They can go and sort of take a look themselves and say, hey, I'm going to lose between 2 p.m. to sunset for 3/4 of the year, so they can have a little bit of an idea of the impact on their own. I'm tremendously excited when somebody thinks it's important enough and to lift it up into the because it is something that is valuable. To take somebody's light away is a terrible thing, and obstructing somebody else's sky to the point where they may not even see the sky at all. It's hard to see weather variation in the same way. If you don't see the sky, I think it's quite inhuman
No,
to
I agree. I mean, I think it's sort of almost like it's not until, well, I think some of us are very sensitive to, like, so I suffer from seasonal depression. I'm very in tune with the circadian rhythm, so I tend to get up early when it's light. All of
yeah,
these things. So it would be a real impact on me if my light kind of got taken away.
yeah,
But I think there's a whole group of people who may not be so in touch, but when it does get taken away, are like, oh my
yeah,
goodness,
yeah.
my life is not as good as it was before.
I often see that with new built properties where people, they'll look at a plan, they'll say, okay, well, the kitchen's here, the kids' bedrooms is going to be here, this plan looks good to me. And meanwhile, it's a very dark apartment, and people don't know until they've lived there for half a year, and then they go, oh, okay, we don't want to, this is depressing, we don't want to be here. And I feel a little bit as though it would be nice if that dialogue was taken within the purchase process of an apartment. Of course it's not, and a lot of people, there's so many things on people's tables, like proximity to schools and work and all sorts of things going on. So it's difficult sometimes to maybe catch all these variables, but I do believe like a really big portion of people, once they've moved in, they'll be affected by that, or it's something that they will feel. But I'm sure you talked with Arnie Loden a little bit about this. There are different chronotypes, and there are different sensitivities. Some of us are very driven by this, and others, their circadian rhythms may be a little bit different and not as affected. But I do wish there would be more of a dialogue about it, because ultimately there's sort of basic ways you're going to interact with a building, right? Is it too hot or cold? Is the air fresh? And after that, or maybe at the same level, is daylight and sunlight is sort of the handshake of the building in many ways. So it would be nice if it's not just about the price.
Well, I mean, and it's fascinating because we've got so Shadowmap's in a couple of property platforms, and one of the stats which I find incredible is as people go down that sort of funnel of choosing a house, they're using it more and more. And actually, over 50% of people on one platform are using it before they basically
nice,
press the buy button.
really great,
So,
yeah.
as a kind of check and balance on a property, it seems to
Yeah.
be something that,
I,
for 50% of people, it's really important.
I've had twice over I've been specialized in this for 15 years, and twice over those 15 years, somebody's called me who is looking to buy a flat and asked me what I think, what my appraisal is. One guy, I told him that the one he was looking at, was not very good. So he called me back a couple of days later and said, what do you think of the one that's two above it? So he actually went and paid more money, and that was good because it really helped him make a decision that he could live with, literally. But of course I can't do that for everybody. So it's great that you can offer that, because I don't charge anything for that. I just like that people are engaged, but that people can take that into their own hands and they can weigh different options and stuff like that. In Sweden, I think something funny has happened here, and I'd like to bring it up. So throughout the 30s to the 50s, there was a real push for fresh air and access to light and exercise and healthy living. And so a balcony generally is only within, say, 90 degrees of south. You rarely in that time got a balcony facing a different direction. So people grew up thinking, and not just the people in those generations, but people shortly after, because they lived with those balconies, they grew up on those balconies. So there's like a social contract of a balcony. You carry with you a certain expectation that it's going to have direct sun, and the way it is now is that we build so dense, and you have these balconies that are way down in the courtyard, and maybe they're not facing south anymore. Or maybe you have balconies on two sides. And I think people see, oh, I get a balcony. And in their head, they have this expectation of a certain amount of direct
Right.
sun. But then when they move in, they realize, there's a minute of direct sun over the entire year. And
Yeah.
it would have been nice to have known that beforehand. They assume, as I say, there's a social idea of what a balcony is. All balconies had sun. So the expectation that in this new building that the balcony has sun, and then it doesn't. But you paid for it anyways. So I'd like to see again more people taking that interest and saying, well, this balcony fits me very well, insofar as I'm at home in the afternoon and I can see when I get home there's sun just starting to reach this balcony, or I like breakfast in the mornings. This balcony I can get between 9 o'clock and 11:30. I have sun. So to sort of match your own sort of what you want that balcony to do with the movement of the sun, I think is a unique opportunity. I would like to see a rating system for balconies, but of course the developers are not one to jump on board for that. They're busy selling, lots of different balconies to different orientations. I think it works against their interests to sort of reveal what they're actually selling.
But I mean, this is why I guess things like this conversation are so important. So you get people to think about this before they make a mistake, which they then spend sometimes years regretting. I mean, it's interesting because we're pondering about moving house, and we started actually looking in the winter, and I've decided that you should always go and find a new house in the middle of winter, because then you understand what it's really like.
Yeah.
But now, it's summer and everybody's out, spring's coming and everybody's out trying to find houses. And of course, you have
everything looks nice. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's really kind of fascinating because, as I say, I'm affected. And, you just don't want to make that wrong decision. But, I was even reading some research that, like, I think it's in China or Japan that, not a well-lit house, a house with lots of sunlight will command a sort of 7 to 10% premium in terms of its value. So there's kind of value in sunlight.
Yeah, I think that's true anywhere. I mean, as you move up, the pricing tends to go up, and that's all daylight views and access to sunlight, and to some degree access to fresh air. It's always been that way. I think what's important to me, I mean, the people that have the money, they always find good views in daylight and access to sun. They always have it, right? So it is a commodity. What is interesting to me is that everybody is empowered. That we don't go beyond a minimum level. We don't say, well, this person, they are sort of the lower end of the income chain, so it's okay if they don't see the sky. And the thing is, they might be working a job in a shopping center where they don't see the sky there either. So to sort of protect at the lower end of the income scale, and this goes to students in Sweden. They're starting to really make special considerations for student housing,
Right.
and students, of course, they're some of the most prone, young women in particular, to depression. May not have access to daylight, and here we are taking a group which is sort of, in terms of daylight, maybe already marginalized, and saying, well, this is okay if your housing is, you don't need direct sun, you don't need much daylight, you don't need to see the sky. And I do think there is a health connection there, and I'm not sure that the legislatures have made it, or maybe they're under too much political pressure just to build things. I think that's more accurate, is the people who make the codes suspect and would like it a particular way, but then the political will to back them up on that statement, I think, is probably a reality, particularly in the climate of deregulation.
But again, it's fascinating because, just behind me is this incredible resource which, powers life, and it makes us not having that as a kind of primary consideration in terms of build. It is sort of extraordinary. Again, it was really fascinating to hear you talk about that, like the 50s or 60s, where we kind of lost touch with that. And, I think it was around that time that capitalism really kind of kicked off. And
Well, I think what happened, when I think about what happens here in Sweden, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, there was a lot of maybe smaller scale buildings, 3 to 4 story, and then they were quite successful. They often had windows that were a little bit larger and maybe even thin window frames and balconies oriented rightly. And then what happened is we moved into the 60s, and then the population boom after the war, and you really had a problem with all those baby boomers kids looking for a place to live. And so then mass production came into it, and you got neighborhoods that were sort of machine processed. They would actually had fairly good daylight and sunlight, but they weren't really neighborhoods. So there's been this swing in the pendulum back to try to create a more a courtyard structured, which is not great for daylight, but maybe a little better for making a neighborhood, as opposed to a machine for living, which is sort of these. And because in that machine it was sort of rows of very tall buildings that were based on sunlight angles, and although they had good daylight, sunlight, and fresh air, that they maybe had some dead spaces. It was green space between them, but socially maybe it wasn't the best. So it's difficult to balance those two. This sort of, well, how do we make towns that are have a density that has some sense of community, but at the same time let in enough daylight and sunlight that people are happy. So it's not an easy question, and they're sort of both extremes. Like, we shouldn't be designing only for daylight. It should be part of the conversation when we are designing for these other social factors and many other factors that affect the decisions we make on the urban planning level.
No, it's fascinating. It really is fascinating. I mean, I guess if you go back to town planners from a couple of centuries ago, they understood the importance of things like green spaces and, as you say, there were big windows and things like that. So it's kind of interesting that that's become part of the narrative again. And I think it's thanks to people like yourself who've kind of made sure that it is part of.
Well, the two things we're up against now are just the demand for density and property values.
Yeah.
On the one hand, we have people really waking up to the health aspects. I've heard it likened to having a good exercise regime. A good light hygiene has huge benefits. So we have people waking up to that. On the other hand, we have property values going through the roof and a need to build densely, and that's a pretty big juggernaut. There's money involved there, and it's difficult often to provide a counterweight for those interests. And then, of course, we also have, with climate change, a really smart focus on energy. But of course, saving energy also often works against daylight. It wants smaller windows, thicker buildings, maybe even darker glass. So we're trying to balance, on the one hand, the people's need, but then these other factors that prevail. I think it's a constant battle. I don't say the health aspects. It's good to have some momentum there, but at the same time, I feel like we're not gaining or losing much territory. In fact, we probably lose a little more than we gain. So we need to really stay active in having the conversations with people, because when you start talking to people about it, you find out that it's really important to them.
It's fascinating. Well, listen, we're sort of running out of time. I mean, I could literally talk all day about this. It's your experience and insight are just so amazing. So, I think we should plan to have another podcast at some point, and perhaps we can go into a lot more detail about home design and office design. And
yeah, I'd really like that. That would be great.
Arnie was talking about offices where have greenhouses being built on, so people can kind of get out into greenhouses in the London. So there's lots of things kind of going on. Which we should talk about. I
have quite a few buildings, some of which I've lived in or which I very would like to speak about. I think it's so interesting with these buildings that it's you when you go to buy a property, you have this idea of how it will perform, but you don't really know it, and you maybe have these preconceived ideas, but a tool like Shadowmapper can help you with that. But there's also after live so much depends on location, of course, but the sort of patterning of light over the year and just what it can bring, and it's a bit like it's a bit like meeting somebody where I mean nobody's perfect, and you realize that okay, this is pretty much what I thought, but then there's aspects which you never could conceive of. And that's sort of what I feel like when you live in a house for a while, and just sort of the intimacy of the subtle interplays of light. I think that's something we could discuss. Obviously, and I have many stories I'd like to tell about the
No,
buildings the buildings I've known.
yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'd love to tell you a bit about the house I'm in, and
Yeah, yeah,
exactly that intimate relationship.
exactly. And I think that would be very interesting thing to continue to
Definitely.
talk about, because as you do that, people begin to relate to their own experiences and think about what's important to them. But it'll always surprise you. I often say I'd like to live in a building. I need to be in a building a year to really understand. Now, daylight simulation will help a little bit. If really deep daylight, not just code stuff, but really deep daylight simulation. But there is ultimately this sort of visceral relationship you have with light, and that familiarity of your own space, which I think is a tremendously exciting aspect of us as human beings.
Well, I'm thinking it kind of goes to the fact that we 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 have this relationship with sun and light, which is sort of one of the not what it is the primary kind of or one of the primary relationships we have, but we often don't think about it. So actually
You
taking
take
some
it for
time,
granted, yeah.
yeah, exactly,
It's a bit like fresh air, right? I mean,
exactly. So these things which we take for, but actually when you kind of stop and ponder them and their importance, you realize that there's so much going on the whole time, and we're making adjustments sort of mentally, physically the whole time to kind of optimize this, because our bodies are sort of telling us that they kind of need it. So anyway, listen, we'll save that for the next podcast, but I did want to know, if you had the perfect place to have a house and perfect orientation, where would it be?
well, I think this gets a little bit into what we were looking to pick up on the next podcast, but I do think that there are some basic tips I can have, and it's something that I'd like to follow up later on. But I do think it's important that you're not getting every climate has a different relationship, and for me that was one of the reasons why I was drawn to buy also a second house in Spain, because I want to learn another climate.
Right.
And just again, it's a bit like people, as you learn that other. It was funny because Shadowmapper wasn't really around when we bought our apartment, and I said to my wife, our place has a large outdoor terrace, and it goes from west and it stretches around to the north. It's only 50 square meters in the apartment. It's a 50 square meter terrace, and I said to my wife, well, that north side, it's cool. I don't know how much sun it gets. Of course, I'm thinking from my Scandinavian, long shadows. And sure enough, of course, the shadow, it's all of 10 centimeters, already in April. Like because I didn't have that familiarity with it. Now I did, of course, when we bought the place, I had these sort of diagrams out, but I still, even though I'm a specialist, I didn't really understand that kind of, but that would sort of be my ultimate, I guess, where you have this interaction between indoor and outdoor, and windows on different sides, where you could see the interplay of shadow and light throughout the day. Ultimately, you need to there's some sort of basic rules, like you don't want the light coming deep into the space from the west, causing overheating and glare. Of course, that's a very big part of being a daylight specialist, is working with those aspects. It's not we don't just want a lot of daylight. We also want to avoid overheating and glare. I want to make that clear. But there's certain principles you can use, and a top lit space, for example, like a skylight, adds a whole new dimension that really to see the light patch move. And I often say that if you just have, you're really kind of working with one hand behind your back if you're just having vertical windows. Putting a skylight in really adds an extra amount of pop that a lot of people, when I turned 50, I was looking at sort of my back of my life, and I figured, well, I have a skylight, so that makes me. In fact, I have two. I have one in my bathroom too, and it just, yeah, for me it adds so much, not just the volume of light, but to see that connection with the sky. So I would say ultimately you need a building that respects the different solar patterns, whether that's in Alicante, Spain, like we have, or whether it's in Stockholm, or in the UK, wherever you are. You need, and then to use different orientations. That's important as well, and top lighting, rooms with windows in more than one direction always. That's sort of, so I won't answer the question directly. I'll just sort of
but I
provide
think
some general principles.
it's really helpful, and I love that notion of kind of getting to know the climate as well, or the latitude.
Yeah.
So that really kind of speaks volumes. So, well, thank you so much for joining me.
Yep.
It's been a brilliant conversation. I look forward to the next one very much.
I've enjoyed it very much, Dave. Thank you.